4 suspects. The conversation hovered round undiscovered and unpunished crimes. Everyone in turn vouchsafed their opinion. Colonel Bantry, his plump, amiable wife, Jane Helier, Dr. Lloyd, and even old Miss Marple. The one person who did not speak was the one best fitted, in most people's opinion, to do so. Sir Henry Clithering, ex-Commissioner of Scotland Yard, sat silent, twisting his moustache, or rather stroking it, and half smiling, as though at some inward thought that amused him. "Sir Henry," said Mrs. Bantry at last, "if you don't say something I shall scream. Are there a lot of crimes that go unpunished, or are they not?"
You're thinking of newspaper headlines, Mrs. Bantry. Scotland Yard at fault again, and a list of unsolved mysteries to follow.
"Which really, I suppose, form a very small percentage of the whole," said Dr. Lloyd.
"Well, that is so. The hundreds of crimes that are solved and the perpetrators punished are seldom heralded and sung. But that isn't quite the point at issue, is it? When you talk of undiscovered crimes and unsolved crimes, you're talking of 2 different things. First category come all the crimes that Scotland Yard never hears about, the crimes that no one even knows have been committed."
"But I suppose there aren't many of those?"
"Aren't there?"
"Oh, Sir Henry, you don't mean there are?" "I should think," said Miss Marple thoughtfully, "that there must be a very large number." The charming old lady, with her old-world unruffled air, made her statement in a tone of utmost placidity.
"My dear Miss Marple," said Colonel Bantry,
"Well, of course, a lot of people are stupid, and stupid people get found out, whatever they do. But there are quite a number who aren't stupid, and one shudders to think of what they might accomplish, unless they have very strongly rooted principles."
"Yes," said Sir Henry, "there are a lot of people who aren't stupid. How often does some crime come to light simply by reason of a bit of unmitigated bungling? And each time one asks oneself the question, if this hadn't been bungled, would anyone ever have known?"
"That's very serious, Clithering," said Colonel Bantry. "It's very serious indeed."
"Is it?"
"What do you mean, is it? Well, of course. I mean, it's serious."
"You say crime goes unpunished, but does it? Unpunished by law, perhaps, but cause and effect work outside the law. To say that every crime brings its own punishment is by way of being a platitude, yet, in my opinion, nothing can be truer."
Perhaps, but that doesn't alter the seriousness, seriousness."
99 people out of 100 are doubtless of your way of thinking, but you know, it isn't really guilt that's important. It's innocence. That's the thing nobody will realize.
"I don't understand," said Jane Helier. "I do. When Mrs. Trent found half a crown missing from her bag, the person it affected most was the Daily woman, Mrs. Arthur. Of course the Trents thought it was her, but being kindly people, and knowing she had a large family and a husband who drinks, well, they naturally didn't want to go to extremes, but they felt very differently towards her nonetheless, and they didn't leave her in charge of the house when they went away, which made a great difference to her, and other people began to get a feeling about her too. And then it suddenly came out that it was the governess. Mrs. Trent saw her through the door reflected in a mirror. The purest chance, though I prefer to call it Providence. And that, I think, is what Sir Henry means. Most people would only be interested in who took the money, and it turned out to be the most unlikely person, just like in detective stories. But the real person it was life and death to was poor Mrs. Arthur, who'd done nothing. That is what you mean, isn't it, Sir Henry?"
"Yes, Miss Marple, you have hit on my meaning exactly. The charwoman person was lucky. In the instance you relate, her innocence became shown. But some people may go for a lifetime crushed by the weight of a suspicion that is really unjustified."
"Are you thinking of some particular instance, Sir Henry?" asked Mrs. Bantry shrewdly.
"As a matter of fact, Mrs. Bantry, I am. A very curious case. A case when we believe murder to have been committed, but with no possible chance of ever proving it."
"Oh, I suppose poison. Something untraceable," breathed Jane.
Dr. Lloyd moved restlessly, and Sir Henry shook his head. "No, dear lady, not the secret arrow poison of a South American Indian. I wish it were something of that kind. We have to deal with something much more prosaic. So prosaic, in fact, that there is no hope of bringing the deed home to its perpetrator. An old gentleman who fell downstairs and broke his neck. One of those regrettable accidents that happen every day.
But what happened really?
Who can say? A push from behind, a piece of cotton or string tied across the top of the stairs and carefully removed afterwards. This we shall never know.
But you do think that it wasn't an accident? Asked the doctor.
It's rather a long story, but we're pretty sure. As I said, there's no chance of being able to bring the deed home to anyone. The evidence would be too flimsy. But there is the other aspect of the case, the one I was speaking about. You see, there were 4 people who might have done the trick. 1 guilty, but the other 3 are innocent. And unless the truth is found out, those 3 are going to remain under the terrible shadow of doubt.
I think, said Mrs. Bantry, that you had better tell us your long story.
I needn't make it so very long. I can condense at any rate the beginning. It deals with a German secret society, the Swazi Hand, something after the lines of the Camorra, or what is most people's idea of it, a scheme of blackmail and terrorization. The thing started quite suddenly after the war and spread to an amazing extent. Numberless people were victimized by it. The authorities were not successful in coping with it, for its secrets were jealously guarded. It was almost impossible to find anyone who could be induced to betray them. Nothing much was ever known about it in England, but in Germany it was having a most paralyzing effect. It was finally broken up and dispersed through the efforts of one man, a Dr. Rosen, who had at one time been very prominent in Secret Service work. He became a member, penetrated its inmost circle. He was, as I say, instrumental in bringing about its downfall. But he was, in consequence, a marked man. It was deemed wise that he should leave Germany, at any rate for a time. He came to England, and we had letters about him from the police in Berlin. He came and had a personal interview with me. His point of view was both dispassionate, resigned. He had no doubts what the future held for him. "They will get me, Sir Henry, there is not a doubt of it." He was a big man, a fine head, deep voice, only a slight guttural intonation to tell of his nationality. "It is a foregone conclusion. It does not matter. I am prepared. I faced the risk when I undertook this business. I have done what I set out to do. The organization can never be got together again. But there are many members of it at liberty, and they will take the only revenge they can, my life. And it is simply a question of timing. I am anxious that the time should be as long away as possible. You see, I am collecting and editing some very interesting material, the result of my life's work. I should, if possible, like to complete the task." I could not but admire him. I told him we would take all precautions, but he waved my words aside. "Some day, sooner or later, they will get me. When that day comes, do not distress yourself. You will, I have no doubt, done all that was possible." He then proceeded to outline his plans, which were simple enough. He proposed to take a small cottage in the country, where he could live quietly and go on with his work. In the end, he selected a village in Somerset, King's Netton, which was 7 miles from a railway station, singularly untouched by civilization. A very charming cottage was bought, and he had various improvements and alterations made. He settled down most contentedly. His household consisted of his niece Greta, a secretary, an old German servant who had served him faithfully for nearly 40 years, and an outside handyman and gardener who was a native of King's Netton. The 4 suspects. Exactly, the 4 suspects. There's not much more to tell. Life went on peacefully at King's Netton for 5 months. Then the blow fell. Dr. Rosen fell down the stairs one morning and was found dead about half an hour later. At the time the accident must have taken place, Gertrude was in the kitchen with the door closed and heard nothing. So she says. Fraulein Greta was in the garden planting some bulbs. Again, So she says. The gardener, Dobbs, was in the small potting shed having his elevenses, so he says, and the secretary was out for a walk. And once more there is only his word for it. No one has an alibi, no one can corroborate anyone else's story. But one thing is certain. No one from outside could have done it, for a stranger in the little village of King's Natton would be noticed without fail. Both the back and front doors were locked, each member of the household having their own key. So you see it narrows down to those four, and yet each one seems to be above suspicion. Greta, his own brother's child. Gertrude, 40 years of faithful service. Dobbs, who's never been out of King's Natton. And Charles Templeton, the secretary. Yes, said Colonel Bantry. Now what about him? He seems the suspicious person to my mind. What do you know of him? Well, it is what I know about him that puts him completely out of court, at any rate at the time. You see, Charles Templeton was one of my own men. Ah! Yes, I wanted to have someone on the spot. At the same time, I didn't want to cause talk in the village. Rosen needed a secretary, so I put Templeton on the job. He's a gentleman, speaks German fluently, and is altogether a very reliable fellow. But then who do you suspect? They all seem so, well, impossible. Yes, so it appears. But you can look at the thing from another angle. Fräulein Greta was his niece and a very lovely girl, but the war has shown us time and again that brother can turn against sister, or father against son, and so on. And the loveliest and gentlest of young girls did some of the most amazing things. The same thing applies to Gertrude, and who knows what other forces might be at work in her case. A quarrel perhaps with her master, a growing resentment all the more lasting because of the long faithful years behind her. Elderly women of that class can be amazingly bitter sometimes. Dobbs, was he right outside it because he'd no connection with the family? Money will do much. In some way Dobbs might have been approached and bought. For one thing seems certain. Some message or some order must have come from outside. Otherwise, why 5 months' immunity? The agents of the society must have been at work, not yet sure of Rosen's perfidy. They delayed till the betrayal had been traced to him beyond doubt. And then, all doubts aside, they must have sent their message to the spy within the gates. A message that said kill. "Oh, how nasty!" said Jane Hellier, and shuddered. So how did the message come? That was the point I tried to elucidate. One of those 4 people must have been approached or communicated with in some way. There would be no delay, I knew that. As soon as the command came, it would be carried out. That was the peculiarity of the Swansea hand. So I went into the question, went into it in a way that will probably strike you as being ridiculously meticulous. Who had come to the cottage that morning? I eliminated nobody. Here's the list. He took an envelope from his pocket and selected a paper from its contents. The butcher, bringing some neck of mutton, investigated and found correct. The grocer's assistant, bringing a packet of corn flour, 2 pounds of sugar, a pound of butter, and a pound of coffee, also investigated and found correct. The postman, bringing 2 circulars for Fraulein Rosen, a local letter for Gertrude, 3 letters for Dr. Rosen, 1 with a foreign stamp, and 2 letters for Mr. Templeton, 1 also with a foreign stamp. It may interest you to see these for yourself. They were handed to me by the various people concerned, or collected from the waste paper basket. I need hardly say they've been tested by experts for invisible ink, etc. No excitement of that kind is possible. Everyone crowded round to look. The catalogues were respectively from a nurseryman, from a prominent London fur establishment, and 2 bills addressed to Dr. Rosen were of a local one for seeds for the garden and one from a London stationery firm. The letter addressed to him ran as follows. My dear Dr. Rosen, just back from Dr. Helmuth's baths. I saw Edgar Jackson the other day. He and Amos Perry had just come back from Sing 2. In all honesty, I can't say I envy them the trip. Let me have news of you soon. As I said before, beware of a certain person. You know who I mean, though you don't agree. Yours, Georgine. Mr. Templeton's mail consisted of this bill, which, as you see, is an account rendered from his tailor, and a letter from a friend in Germany. The latter, unfortunately, he tore up whilst out on his walk. Finally, we have the letter received by Gertrude.
Dear Mrs. Schwartz, we're hoping as how you may be able to come to the social on Friday evening. The vicar says as he hopes you will, one and all being welcome. The recipe for the ham was very good, and I thanks you for it. Hoping as this finds you well, and that we shall see you Friday, I remain yours faithfully, Emma Green.
Dr. Lloyd smiled a little over this. So did Mrs. Bantry. I think the last letter can be put out of court. Yes, I thought the same, but I took the precaution of verifying that there was a Mrs. Green at the church social. One can't be too careful, you know. That's what our friend Miss Marple always says. You're lost in a daydream, Miss Marple. What are you thinking of?
Oh, so stupid of me. I was just wondering why the word honesty in Dr. Rosen's letter was spelt with a capital H.
Mrs. Bantry picked it up.
So it is. Oh! Yes, dear. I thought you'd notice.
Colonel Bantry said, "There's a definite warning in that letter. That's the first thing that caught my attention. I notice more than you think, you know. Yes, there's a definite warning there. But against whom?" Well, that's the rather curious point about the letter. According to Templeton, Dr. Rosen opened it at breakfast and tossed it across to him, saying he didn't know the fellow from Adam.
"But it wasn't the fellow," said Jane Hellyer. "It was signed Georgina."
"Well, it's difficult to say. It might be Georgie. It looks more like Georgina. It just strikes me as the writing of a man." "You know, that's interesting," said Colonel Bantry. "His tossing it across the table like that and pretending he knew nothing about it. Wanted to watch somebody's face, I reckon. Whose face, though, eh? The girl's or the man's?"
"Or even the cook's, dear. She might have been in the room bringing in the breakfast. But what I don't see is... Oh, it's most peculiar."
Miss Marple drew closer to her, and her finger went out and touched the sheet of paper. Miss Marple and Mrs. Bantry murmured together.
Jane Hellyer said suddenly, "But why did the secretary tear up the other letter? That seems, I don't know, queer. Why should he have letters from Germany anyway? Oh, though, of course, if he's above suspicion, as you say." "Oh, but Sir Henry didn't say that."
Miss Marple looked up quickly from her murmured conference with Mrs. Bantry.
"He said 4 suspects, so that shows that he includes Mr. Templeton. I am right, am I not, Sir Henry?"
"Yes, Miss Marple. I have learned one thing through bitter experience. Never say to yourself that anyone is above suspicion. I gave you reasons just now why 3 of these people might, after all, be guilty, unlikely as it seemed. I did not at that time apply the process to Templeton, but I came to it at last through pursuing the rule I'd mentioned. I was forced to recognize this, that every army and every navy and every police force has a certain number of traitors within its ranks, much as we hate to admit it. I examined dispassionately the case of Charles Templeton. I asked myself very much the same questions as Miss Hellyer. Why should he alone of all the house not be able to produce the letter he had received? A letter, moreover, with a German stamp on it. Why should he have letters from Germany? Well, the last question was an innocent one, and I actually put it to him. His reply came simply enough. His mother's sister was married to a German. The letter had been from a German girl cousin. So I learned something I did not know before. Charles Templeton had relations with people in Germany. That put him definitely on the list of suspects, very much so. He is my own man, a lad I've always liked and trusted. But in common justice and fairness, I must admit he heads the list. But there it is. I do not know. I do not know. And in all probability, I never shall. It's not a question of punishing a murderer. It is a question that to me seems 100 times more important. The blighting, perhaps, of an honourable man's whole career because of suspicion, a suspicion I dare not disregard.
"Then, Sir Henry, if I understand you rightly, it is this young Mr. Templeton only who is so much on your mind."
"Yes, in a sense. It should in theory be the same for all 4, I know, but it is not. Dobbs, for instance, suspicion may attach to him in my mind, but it will not actually affect his career. Nobody in the village has ever had any idea that old Dr. Rosen's death was anything but an accident. Gertrude is slightly more affected. It must make, for instance, a difference in Fraulein Rosen's attitude towards her. but that possibly is not of great importance to her. As for Greta Rosen, well, here we come to the crux of the matter. Greta is a very pretty girl, and Charles Templeton is a good-looking young man, and for 5 months they were thrown together with no outer distractions. The inevitable happened. They fell in love with each other, even if they did not come to the point of admitting it in words. And then the catastrophe happens. It is 3 months ago now, and a day or two after I returned, Greta Rosen came to see me. She'd sold the cottage and was returning to Germany, having finally settled up her uncle's affairs. She came to me personally, although she knew I had retired, because it was really about a personal matter she wanted to see me. She beat about the bush a little, but at last it all came out. What did I think? That letter with the German stamp, she'd worried and worried about it, the one Charles had torn up. Was it all right? Surely it must be all right. Of course, she believed his story, but, oh, if only she could know for certain. You see, the same feeling, the wish to trust, but the horrible lurking suspicion thrust resolutely to the back of her mind, but persisting nevertheless. I spoke to her with absolute frankness, and asked her to do the same. I asked her whether she had been on the point of caring for Charles, and he for her.
I think so. Yes, I know it was so. We were so happy. Every day passed so contentedly. We knew, but there was no hurry. All the time in the world. Some day he would tell me he loved me, and I should tell him I too. But now you can guess it is all changed. A black cloud has come between us. We are constrained. We do not know what to say. It is perhaps the same with him as me. We are saying to ourselves, if I were sure, if only I were sure. That is why, Sir Henry, I beg of you to say, you may be sure, whoever it is, it was not Charles Templeton. Say it to me, please say it. I beg, I beg.
And damn it all, Sir Henry brought his fist down with a bang on the table. I couldn't say it to her. They'll drift farther and farther apart, those two, with suspicion like a ghost between them, a ghost that can't be laid. Ah, nothing to be done. Unless Miss Marple can help us. Can't you, Miss Marple? I've a feeling that letter might be in your line, you know. The one about the church social. Does it remind you of something or someone? Something to make it absolutely plain? Can you do something to help two helpless people who want to be happy? Behind the whimsicality there was something earnest in his appeal. He'd come to think very highly of the mental powers of this frail, old-fashioned maiden lady. He looked across at her with something like hope in his eyes. Miss Marple coughed and smoothed her lace.
It does remind me a little of Annie Pulteney. Of course, the letter is perfectly plain, both to Mrs. Bantry and myself. I don't mean the church social letter, the other one. You living so much in London and not being a gardener, Sir Henry, would not have been likely to notice.
Eh? Notice what?
Mrs. Bantry reached out a hand and selected a catalogue. She opened it and read aloud with gusto. Dr. Helmouth Spath, pure lilac, a wonderfully fine flower, carried on exceptionally long and stiff stem, splendid for cutting with garden decoration, a novelty of striking beauty. Edgar Jackson, beautifully shaped chrysanthemum-like flower of a distinct brick-red colour. Amos Perry, brilliantly red, highly decorative. Tsingtao, brilliant orange-red, showy garden plant and lasting cut flower. Honesty, with a capital H, you remember. Honesty, rose and white shades, enormous perfect-shaped flower. Well, dahlias, and their initials spell death.
But the letter came to Dr. Rosen himself.
That was the clever part of it. That was the warning in it. What would he do, getting a letter from someone he didn't know, full of names he didn't know? Why, of course he would toss it over to his secretary.
Then, after all, it is...
Oh, no, not the secretary. Why, that's what makes it so perfectly clear it wasn't him. He'd never have let that letter be found, if so, and equally he would never have destroyed a letter to himself with a German stamp on it. Really, his innocence is, if you will allow me to say it, shining.
Oh. Then who?
Well, it seems almost certain as anything can be in this world. There was another person at the breakfast table, and she would, quite naturally under the circumstances, put out her hand for the letter and read it. And that would be that. You remember, she got a gardening catalogue by the same post.
Greta Rosen?
In her visit to me? Gentlemen never see through these things. I'm afraid they often think we old women are, well, cats, to see things the way we do. But there it is. One does know a great deal about one's own sex, unfortunately. I've no doubt there was a barrier between them. The young man felt a sudden, inexplicable revulsion. He suspected, purely through instinct, and could not hide the suspicion. And I really think that the girl's visit to you was just pure spite. She was safe enough, really, but she just went out of her way to fix your suspicions definitely on poor Mr. Templeton. You weren't nearly so sure about him until after her visit, were you?
I'm sure it was nothing she said.
Gentlemen never see through these things.
But that girl has committed a cold-blooded murder and gets off scot-free.
No, Sir Henry, not scot-free. Neither you nor I believe that. Remember what you said not long ago? No, Greta Rosen will not escape punishment. To begin with, she must be in with a very queer set of people, blackmailers and terrorists, associates who will do her no good and will probably bring her to a miserable end. As you say, one mustn't waste thoughts on the guilty. It is the innocent who matter. Mr. Templeton, who I dare say will marry that German cousin, his tearing up of a letter looks suspicious, but using the word in quite a different sense from the one we've been using it all evening, a little as though he were afraid of the other girl noticing or asking to see it. Yes, I think there must have been some little romance there. And then there's Dobbs, as you say. I dare say it won't matter much to him. His 11s are probably all he thinks about. And then there's poor old Gertrude, the one who reminded me of Annie Pulteney. Poor Annie Pulteney. 50 years' faithful service, and suspected of making away with Miss Lamb's will, though nothing could be proved. Almost broke the poor creature's faithful heart. And then, after she was dead, it all came to light. In the secret drawer of the tea-caddy, old Miss Lamb had put it there for safety herself. Too late for poor Annie. That's what worries me so about the poor old German woman. When one is old, one becomes embittered very easily. I felt much sorrier for her than Mr. Templeton, who is young and good-looking and evidently a favourite with the ladies. You will write to her, won't you, Sir Henry, and just tell her that her innocence is established beyond doubt. Her dear old master dead, and she no doubt brooding and feeling herself suspected of... Oh, it doesn't bear thinking about.
I will write, Miss Marple. You know, I shall never quite understand you. Your outlook is always a different one from what I expect.
My outlook, I'm afraid, is a very petty one. I hardly ever go out of St. Mary Mead.
And yet you have solved what may be called an international mystery. You have solved it, I'm convinced of that.
Well, I was, I think, well educated for the standards of my day. My sister and I had a German governess, a very sentimental creature. She taught us the language of flowers, a forgotten study nowadays, but most charming. A yellow tulip, for instance, means hopeless love, whilst a China aster means I die of jealousy at your feet. That letter was signed Georgine, which I seem to remember is Dahlia in German. That, of course, made the whole thing perfectly clear. I wish I could remember the meaning of Dahlia, but alas, it eludes me. My memory is not what it was.
At any rate, it didn't mean death.
No, indeed. Horrible, is it not? There are so many sad things in the world.
There are, said Mrs. Bantry with a sigh. It's lucky one has flowers and one's friends. She puts us last, you observe, said Dr. Lloyd.
A man used to send me purple orchids every night to the theatre, said Jane dreamily. I await your favours, that's what that means. Fancy.
Sir Henry gave a peculiar sort of cough and turned his head away. Miss Marple gave a sudden exclamation.
I've remembered. Dahlias mean treachery and misrepresentation.
Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. Hello. I'm so glad you found me. You may know me as MJam from London. I used to have a channel here with lots of stories, all read by me. Sadly, that channel is no longer available, and this channel may not be here for long, so I'm taking this opportunity to ask you to please visit my website where you can sign up for free. You'll find everything there that was on my YouTube channel, plus much, much more. Details are in the description box. I look forward to welcoming you. Thank you.